when you're dealing with a company as large as Hewlett Packard, with tremendous amounts of data, you've got to have a really firm governance hand to make sure that that people aren't that the data is being managed the way that it's supposed to. I mean, IT wants to make sure that your servers aren't crashing, et cetera. There's a lot of infrastructure that's got to go into a lot of management. And that gets in the way. And so what you want to do is break it down into small buckets, small silos that you can give people more flexibility and more control over. And so from that perspective, we want to decentralize. We want silos to a certain degree, because you want the specialists to have full control and full flexibility over the data they're responsible for.
Right. I think the flip side of that coin too, when we talk about data silos, and many of you from large companies actually see this type of thing happen, but there's kind of this idea in a lot of large organizations, and typically the larger the organization, the more I've seen this, where there's this sort of scarcity model that exists. In other words, there's this idea that every organization is subject to limited resources, and if you get resources, that's resources that I could potentially get. And so oftentimes data silos become more cemented or more firm in organizations because of this scarcity model, where people look at it as a scarce resource, they protect it, they prevent other people from getting it. And so that can obviously lead to kind of this negative connotation of data silos. So kind of you can look at data silos in both ways, to be honest with you, and they don't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but as they become larger and more isolated, they end up standing in the way of really being able to get better opportunity in your marketing activities. What does an actual data silo look like? So this is actually taken from some of our previous website, actually. I think it illustrates it really well. Before the split, we had this concept within HPI or HP where we had the marketing site pages and we had the e-commerce site pages. And organizationally, those two groups were completely different groups reporting into completely different chains, ultimately up through different C-level management. And so, not surprising, the data that surrounded both of these different organizations turned out to be very, very different and very unique. Even though, ironically, in order to have very good success in being able to sell, you need to have good intelligence about your customers, which the marketing team had. And in order to know what offers to make to your customers, you needed to typically know what they're buying. And so as a result of this, and ultimately the organizational disconnects that existed previously, we had a lot of problems with data silos between these two organizations, and it very much took on more of the negative connotation of things where it was hoarded, it was protected, there was process put into place not to protect the resource necessarily, but to protect the organization from losing control to be able to tell the story.
Actually, to jump into that, I mean, some of the silos that you see here would show themselves in very tangible ways. For example, the e-commerce stores had this sort of conceit that they were responsible for 100% of the revenue at the old HP, because, well, if you go online and you look at the reports, there's the money, right? I mean, that's what we can account for. It's all us. We're the guys. And they would tend to forget that we sold most of our product through the channel. And so the product pages were really designed for the channel, for those folks going out to Walmart, Best Buy, and Sears. And the e-commerce online guys would forget about it. It was funny. I remember once we went to a conference. We introduced the head of our HP store to the chief of analytics for Best Buy. They're like, "Yeah, you guys should talk." And kind of was a little embarrassed to realize that they were frenemies and really didn't want to sit together.
So you really do get this sense of divisions within organizations to create these kinds of data boundaries. What are some of the common ones I've seen? Obviously e-commerce and marketing is a big one that I see in large orgs. Finance and operations, that's another good example. Completely different key performance indicators driving those businesses. As a result, you end up having very different views of the data, and yet knowing operationally where you stand in terms of units that are shipped versus units available, and knowing how much you've actually sold are critical pieces of information to integrate. UX team and everybody else. I hope I haven't offended any UX people out there. Very different objectives in terms of user experience versus what they might be measuring. Cats and dogs. Those are the types of silos that end up occurring within different organizations. what really happens as a result of these data silos is that collaboration doesn't happen typically because the organizations are as siloed as the data. Data ends up getting actioned suboptimally, so you end up having this nether region where there's gaps in being able to make offers to customers. And in the end, we end up having a lot of missed opportunities. So what's happened probably, I'd say, in the last 10 or 15 years is as companies have gotten to a scale where they begin seeing how data becomes siloed in organizations and processes and architectures become siloed, some of the solution that's been used to be able to address that is this concept of the federated architecture. Now, by show of hands, how many of you have heard of federated architectures before? So we have a few here. The idea behind it is it's kind of like an organization saying, okay, we give up. We're too complex to make everything into a single system or a single view of the truth. And so let's just figure out how we make all the systems play nice to each other, right? That's it in a nutshell, right? And it's all of the process and design that goes around federating systems that allows larger organizations to have a sum of the parts is greater than the sum of the whole, where 1 + 1 truly can equal 3 by having these different systems be able to communicate with each other. The result is ultimately greater agility and flexibility because you're not designing to one standard but to many, very much like what Daryl has said. You want to have the people that use the data most frequently have the right kinds of optimizations to it and not necessarily water down and dilute the effectiveness of it for a for a giant megalithic type of data store. You have lower risk and cost containment because you're not redesigning the world. So most of you have been on calls where you're in large organizations and you have somebody who comes in and says, we need a single source, single view. And I think in a federated model, you acknowledge that need, but you build it out of components rather than saying we need to redesign it from the ground up, thus lowering your risk and your costs. And ultimately, the data can flow between these disparate silos. I think the real key thing to know here is that this last bullet point tends to be the hardest part of federation. And that's where the thing that became very clear to us, and this was even from the time when we talked with Chris about what AudienceStream actually does during our pre-sale cycle, is that AudienceStream could actually be used to help us defeat some of these problems with data silos. Because of the way the actual data ends up being organized and a lot of the visitor stitching capabilities that are built into it, we could use it as that middle layer to be able to sew together the different disparate views of data and ultimately make it into a source of truth from which we can act upon very easily. So what does a federated customer intelligence practice actually look like? So, we already kind of talked about how hard it is to map these out. Normally it starts with kind of acknowledging, it's like anything else, acknowledging is the first step in change. You normally have to come up with some sort of an acknowledgement that you've got multiple systems, multiple people, multiple groups, and the complexity of trying to bring all these together. It's almost impossible to get your technology solution into a single solution just because of how much independent execution is going on. Now, this might seem really trivial to bring up, but this is a really hard thing for some companies to do and to kind of accept, right? Especially, it's like once you bring up this concept of federated model, suddenly people can say, oh, well, that means I don't have to go in and redesign a 5-year project to put my customer insights into one place. We can just have things communicate correctly with each other. So this turns out to be an important thing. So coming up with the diagram, and this is the diagram we have down here, the story on how each of these different technologies and solutions interact together across your paid, owned, and earned channels is really critical so you can tell the right story at the right level within the company and help them understand how these systems need to start integrating.
The hardest part, I think, is finding a technology that everybody agrees should hold the stitching, right? So it should be the hub. I mean, in our case, you've got different groups which are all very powerful, very well funded, have strong executive sponsorship who think that they should own, right? That their silo should be the hub. And so finding a technology that everybody agrees to give up some of their control and defer to is tough. I mean, negotiating between IT, between marketing, between analytics, yeah, right, who should own this? And so, you have to find a solution that everybody's willing to defer to.
It's funny, there's no shortage of owners in a company who want to own something, but it's awfully hard to find people who actually want to get stuff done. actually. And that's a common complexity in federated models, is everybody wants to say, ooh, I want to be at the nexus right there, because if I control it, that means that I'm in charge of it. I get to call the shots, I get to have the power, I get to have the budget. In reality, what we find is that action is 9/10 of the law. And so by federating your systems and using a solution that allows things to connect together and then showing the action immediately, that ends up winning more hearts and minds than just simply going in and dictating by fiat how things actually need to play out. So this is one of our case studies that we have. It's a project internally that we call Highline. And basically the idea behind it, as we started to come up with this, was how do we basically take our full cycle of engaging with the customer from a marketing planning standpoint to execution to actual digital engagement, all the way through lead nurturing, all the way through to sales engagement, because of course HP Enterprises, we're not just selling a computer or a printer, we're selling multi-million-dollar consulting engagements to large enterprise customers or enterprise level software. This is not something that you're just going to make a buy decision right away. And there's conflict from a channel perspective because, ultimately we're basically working with, in some cases, accounts or named accounts that might already have sales groups that have priority over those things. And how do we construct things from a digital perspective so that the data can flow back and forth so that as customers come in, they get the right experience? The most important thing we did from a federation standpoint is really draw a line in the sand and say, what exactly is our keying structure going to be so that we can connect these disparate systems? And we recognized that this needed to, by its very nature, be a tiered approach. So in other words, we didn't just simply say we wanted to do digital multi-channel. We recognized that we have enough offline customers, yes, even HPE has offline customers, right? Where we needed to think about things from a full multi-channel and a digital multi-channel standpoint. And so the most important thing for us to do to federate these different systems together so that we have the right visibility of the customer at any given point is to design what that key structure actually needed to look like. And we're still having to go through and re-educate people who maybe are grounded on this idea that my little infrastructure needs to have all of this data imported into it, that we no longer have to think about it on such strict, let's redesign our system standpoint. We can think about it by connecting all of these independent data points into something that's a more cohesive value proposition that we can then push into our digital channels. So for us, this was a critical component of being able to put together what we call our super key should look like between these different systems. From there, the actual connection of the data actually became much easier because AudienceStream naturally is going to connect all of those primary keys and foreign keys together, and through visitor stitching be able to allow us, as we gain additional information about different customers, what it is we can do to be able to take action on them. From a connectivity standpoint, a lot of our integrations became much simpler because of this. So if you think about it, with our connectivity, right up here in this before sequence right here, this was part of the project where we're actually working with our data science team, and we're pulling in some different data from offline resources and marshaling it into a real-time offer system. And the team that was building the real-time offer system, they were basically going to build out an entire recommendation system and be able to make it so it could push it right into Target, Adobe Target, which is what we use for a lot of our personalization. In the process of building this, we have these requests that they're actually having to push up into Target through REST calls. And we came back and basically said, look, why go through all of the trouble of tooling this to just one system? Let's put it into AudienceStream so that we can in real time be able to shape that information and be able to not just enrich our Adobe data set, but any of our tagging data set. I mean, heaven forbid we need to actually connect some of this audience data over to ClickTail or any of our other analytics assets or share it out with our third parties. When we do a single point integration, we're locked into a vendor vertical, right? When we do an AudienceStream integration, just by changing that one line of code, we've suddenly enabled it across all of our different tagging assets or any of our different audiences, not to mention being able to take action on it within AudienceStream itself.
And another advantage of that, obviously, is that it gives us the flexibility to change vendors if we have to. Because,
right.
Believe it or not, a couple of times a year, we're doing rolling RFPs. And we find that, there's a new capability that we want to have the flexibility to take advantage of.
We are just today kicking off a project on that very thing. I mean, the reality is in large companies, In many cases, because we don't always have the same growth engines that other smaller companies might have, we're constantly looking at ways that we meet our bottom line by going back and reevaluating what are the actual capabilities we're getting from each of these vendors, and are there redundancies? And so by having something like an audience stream where we can quickly glue this data together and begin taking action, suddenly the capability discussion becomes a lot clearer as we look at different ways we could integrate the data or move it between different systems, or even switch out entire systems if we need to. Of course, actioning on the data is second nature at this point, because once we get the information into AudienceStream and we define the segments correctly, all of that keyed visitor stitched data then becomes available not just to push back in to our digital context. I mean, the case that I was using right here was being able to move it over into Target. That's a digital to digital type of connection. But now we suddenly have the ability to connect it in more broadly to any of our multi-channel vendors that we might actually have. So for us, it became a very concrete use case around how we use AudienceStream as our glue to be able to connect together all of our disparate sources and our different data silos into a broader, more actionable type of view of the customer. So I thought it was important to put on here, what does AudienceStream not solve? Because this is a critical piece. I think that, you know, setting aside a lot of the hype, we've told you a lot of the strengths of the AudienceStream solution. There are some critical parts that AudienceStream doesn't actually solve, and I know that Tealium's working on these things, but it's helpful, I think, for all of us to talk openly about things that we maybe need to think about. One of the things, anytime we start talking about non-customer-centric approaches, that's a hard thing for AudienceStream to be able to do, particularly in real time. So for example, as we think about collaborative filters where you're doing if this then that type of offers, that type of thing, if you don't have it keyed off of the actual visitor in question, it's hard to actually get AudienceStream to be able to do it. So if all of your keying is basically on some non-visitor ID structure, then at the end of the day, you end up running into gaps in being able to do that. Now, in many cases, you can actually rework the problem so that it is a visitor-centric solution. And in many cases, I would actually argue that's an important exercise to do anyways, because if you're not keying things off of your visitor, it's likely you might have competing offers or competing benefits that you're putting in front of your customers that aren't aligned. And so it's an important exercise to go back and say, you know, do we really have to do this not based on who the visitor is, but we have to do it based on the content that's being viewed? In most cases, you can actually restructure what that conversation needs to be and work around that gap. I think I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing innovation in that on the AudienceStream platform eventually, because that's a really critical way of being able to think about problems. Also, obviously, it doesn't help you with any of your political alignment, because you're still dealing with real people in these organizations. There's still very real beliefs and even fears that if somehow I help you win, then that means I've lost. It's kind of this zero-sum mentality of how we interact with our colleagues. And so oftentimes what we have to do is engineer the problem around a win-win situation, being able to see it from the standpoint of, hey, let's collaborate on this project rather than this is my project that we're actually working on. Being able to spin up pilots is actually very good. Again, AudienceStream gives us very fast agility to be able to do this. We literally, with this code change, got it last night and had it implemented here today in being able to look at it. So it allows us to very quickly iterate and move it away from one vendor-specific solution to a vendor-agnostic solution and be able to take action. So using pilots is a very non-threatening way to get somebody to take it seriously. I think the fact that it's an open framework lowers the risk of losing control of one's data. Believe it or not, that's a huge barrier that most employees and companies really don't want to get out of. There's this inherent fear that somehow if I give you my organization's data, that I'm going to lose control of being able to tell the story about the data. And so by creating this federated layer where we can push in only the data that were needed in a very limited pilot, it actually lowers that risk of failure and risk of losing control. Anything to add there, Daryl?
No, I think you touched on most of it. I mean, it does help in some ways, like I said, from a political standpoint, right? Because it shows the organization that we have a focus, that we're willing to work collaboratively, that we have a tool that's going to integrate with their systems without degrading or having to have them modify, their data silo in order to work with us. They can pipe their data straight in. So it helps somewhat as well, but you still have to have people skills.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of our key takeaways here, kind of 3 different ways to think about this. First of all, I think all of you that are here probably realize data silos are real. And whether you take the negative or positive viewpoint on what those data silos are and why they happen, they are a real thing and you do have to deal with them. And typically the larger the organization, the more silos you're going to have to deal with. Federation solves many of the data silo issues simply by agreeing that we're going to collaborate rather than rebuild the entire thing from scratch. And really what AudienceStream ends up being is that great middle layer to be able to combine that data, not just for the sake of combining it and reporting on it, but of actually taking action on it, not just in the digital context, but multi-channel. So that's basically what we had. Thank you for your time here today.